Ahoy! There are a few things in SMITE that have been annoying me a lot lately, and one of them I want to talk about today, which is Glyphs. Glyphs were introduced with Season 9, but really cranked up with the Midseason Patch because we got a whole lot of new Glyphs and improved Glyphs or whatever. At this point, I will no longer be silenced. I'm, of course, overdramatic here. I know a lot of you actually love Glyphs, but I want to talk about the problems that I have with them. This begins with the most superficial element of the UI integration. They are technically tier 4 items, but they are not slotted in a tier 4 slot. Instead, you have to buy the tier 3, then click on the tier 3 specifically, and then you can select the upgrade. It feels absolutely terrible, and from what I've heard, it's equally annoying on console. Now, there's a very good chance that this is a UI restriction, engine restriction, and Hi-Res can't really do much about that in the short run. But it's been half a year since the system was introduced, and they decided to lean harder into it, so at that point, I don't think that's really acceptable anymore, and you just have to somehow make an item tree that has an extra row, even if it is complicated. Otherwise, maybe don't make glyphs. This problem also especially expands to new or returning players. There isn't really an explanation given to you when you come into the game telling you, hey, there are these stronger extra upgrades, but you have to click this plus button in the corner of an item to get there. But even beyond this implementation aspect, my problem with glyphs is at least twofold. I dislike the concept of glyphs itself, and I will elaborate on that, and I also dislike many of the items that are currently glyphed up, and I will go through them in detail. First, what is wrong with the concept? Now, I'm somebody who really values complex building in games and really enjoys the theory crafting aspect of SMITE specifically, and I've done it for many, many years, so you probably know about this. I think glyphs, while on the surface they seem like they're adding onto that, actually take away from that. Glyphs create super items with a tier 4, which make the other items that exist in the game worse. Why would you pick an item that you cannot upgrade late game when there's a similarly strong item that gets stronger in late game? So when every ability-based jungler is suddenly almost forced to build Jotun's Wrath, that's most certainly not increasing build variety. And it's especially bad on an item like Jotun's, which is already skewed into one stat, being the 20% cooldown reduction. Why? Because that means that you don't want to pick up more than 2 other cooldown reduction items, or 1 if you're building Breastplate of Valor. And sometimes it used to be good to opt into some other cooldown options, some other pen options and so on, and then build a Breastplate later in the game as a jungler if you're facing a physical heavy comp. But now you wouldn't really want to do that, and you would want to opt into another physical defense item instead, or opt into not building Hydras or whatever else you were considering, in order to make do in a build that is pretty much required to build Jotun's Wrath. And this is just one of many examples. This is the general idea, but this is something that happens with a lot of these glyph items. Glyphs also ended up absorbing some cool effects from other items that are no longer in the game. We'll get to that later. But what it does is it takes these cool effects that could be on other items and offloads all of that into late game. The vast majority of glyph items is not worth upgrading to the glyph level until very late game, with few very notable exceptions. Usually you're better off upgrading some other items first to get more additional effects and more overall stats. Because of that, a lot of unique builds that would previously stand out from each other more because of the different effects that they want to utilize, for example, different crit building path, no longer really exist in the same way because it's only in very, very late game that you'd ever get to see them, and not every game that you play will go that far into late game. Outside of competitive, many games get surrendered early, and many people don't have the gold farm efficiency to always max out their builds. And because of that, you're just seeing way less of all of these unique, cool effects that could be used elsewhere on other items, where they could be built as first item if someone wanted to. So all in all, while they intended to do the opposite, in my opinion, glyphs have made the entire build meta a lot more stale than it ever used to be before. Before we move on to the next section, I just quickly want to let you know that this is essentially just the first part of a multi-part rant, maybe even 3 episodes in total. And I put this separate because it was just too long to fit in with the rest. So if you want to see what's coming next, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you get notified when the next parts come out. Now it's time to talk about the actual items as well, beginning with Jotun's Vigor. Why does this exist? We have an item in this game called Soul Eater that is exactly for this job, for this life-stealing, ability-focused playstyle, and it has cooldown reduction already, it has penetration already, it has everything you want from the idea. There is nothing new in Jotun's Vigor other than an additional movement speed increase as well. It doesn't bring any new concept or anything interesting to the game, it just makes Jotuns stronger for no reason. Next in line, Jotun's Cunning. Actually sounds okay at first. It sounds like it's a 6.25 cooldown reduction across 4 abilities, only that it's all put onto one ability instead and giving that a 25% cooldown reduction. That's not what this item is at all, and that's extremely, well, not necessarily misleading because it is not labeled as cooldown reduction, but rather, cooldown reduction in Smite functions off of your base cooldown. So if you have 50% cooldown reduction, that means your cooldown is halved. Whereas the cooldown reduction of Jotun's Cunning does not work the same way, and instead they made it so that it only reduces your cooldown by 25% of the current cooldown, of the cooldown after the reductions. So if you already have a lot of reduction, then this effect becomes weaker in comparison. So for example, if you had an 8-second cooldown, it would reduce it by 2 seconds, but if you had a 4-second cooldown, it would only reduce it by 1 second, which makes this effect just extremely weak. I think the whole theory, the whole concept of Jotun's Cunning is actually one of the cooler ones, but it could very well be its own item, just have an actual 25% cooldown reduction and make the conditions a little less hectic, maybe just make it after one ability or something. The way it is right now, it's just bad, really. So there's not much to say about it. It's not really worth considering in the first place, and therefore, design-wise, absolutely not good either. Now what these upgrades to Jotuns do, or specifically Jotun's Vigor does, is that it makes the item so good that in pretty much every cooldown reduction focused build, you want to have this. Which is very annoying, because that didn't used to be the case. It used to be builds walking around with Transcendence, going more into Hydras for cooldown reduction, and then going other items for pen. All kinds of different variables that could be considered, and now it's always, oh well, might as well throw in Jotuns, it's so strong in general, and it has this good effect, so why would I not? And we have the same situation with the 2 Executioners. Pretty much every Hunter build now is just running Ferocious Executioner, because why not? It's extremely good, it increases your damage by a lot, and it has a long essay as its text for whatever reason. The Heavy Executioner, also very interesting, changes the passive of the item completely, so hey, hear me out here. We could just make this a new item instead. Hybrid characters use this pretty well, and if you were to blend this with some flat pen like the original Executioner used to be, now that Stonecutting Sword is also nerfed, this could actually be a really cool item for a few niche characters, but effective enough so that it would be picked up a fair bit. But instead it's just an upgraded Executioner, which means the build path for someone who wants this item is incredibly awkward, because basically you don't want the tier 3, you really want the tier 4 though. And yeah, I guess that's something you can buy in late game for that purpose, but again, not really how Executioner was meant to be used or built before that, and not really how the other upgrade works, so just make it its own item. Breastplate of Determination is also an incredibly long wall of text, actually a pretty strong effect. The only reason I would mildly give this a pass is because Breastplate actually doesn't have a passive in itself, much like Jotun's, so that kind of makes it a bit more okay and just basically makes it a tier 4 upgrade that adds a passive. So as such, I'm a bit more okay with that. And at the same time, I see the issue of this also forcing this item a lot, but it's not something that every solo will have to build in every situation. And the same can be said for Breastplate of Vigilance, which is just more niche due to its ultimate reliance, but hey, it's still an okay upgrade that I see more as a normal tier 4, which I'm okay with. Envenom Deathbringer, on the other hand, is absurd, again, because it just forces crit builds to have Deathbringer, which is already a very strong crit item to begin with, and then just adds additional effects on top of that. And I really, really dislike Malicious Deathbringer, because it meant the removal of Malice, which was used by guards that wouldn't necessarily go into a lot of crit, but use it as a single crit item that they could kind of fit in towards the later stages of the build. But now, it's so incredibly expensive that it's pretty much not justifiable anymore. The effect is still cool, but 3,500 gold for that effect is usually not worth paying for someone who's not heavily invested in a crit already, and if they're heavily invested in a crit, then they're going Envenom Deathbringer. Again, I think having these good items by themselves was great, and we used to have them. They were here. We had a crit section that had 2 more items, one of them being Poison Star and the other one being Malice. On the top end we have Magi's Revenge and Magi's Shelter, which you can kind of tell that they're more recent editions in my opinion, because I think they were a lot more carefully crafted towards the design of the original item. They're basically building off the already existing bubble, and when the enemy breaks your bubble, then you get benefit for your team. And I think they are actually some examples of how glyphs could be implemented in a way that makes them make sense and makes them feel decent and doesn't take away too much from the base item. Amulet of Silence is kind of niche and weird, but again, an effect that could easily be on its own item and is not really related to the original passive at all. Likewise, Amulet of Stronghold just has a completely new passive. I can see this one a little bit more, it's just adding more defensive value to this item in late game. The problems here lie probably more with Amulet itself rather than the glyph upgrades. But we haven't talked about the mage items yet, which brings us to the biggest abomination of them all. What is this wall of text? I don't even know what to say about this. I understand what the item was made for, but it really just feels like someone in Hyra's dev team said, I want an item specifically for Shang-Kui that does a lot of things for him at once, please. And then they just decide, yep, that's a fantastic idea. So here, have this infinite text that is somehow good for Shang-Kui. Nimble Bancroft's Talon gets a pass because the text is short, and that's great. The effect kind of ties into the idea of the item a little bit. It's mainly just saying here, if you get extra power from the passive, then that extra power can also give you some extra attack speed, which is good if you're an attack speed focused mage / AA character. So yeah, it's okay. That I think is again an example of how it can be executed in a way that's fine. And also the base item at 2,500 gold isn't too bad in terms of pricing, so making it a tier 4 for 3,100 in late game feels fair. It feels like an upgrade that you can kind of compare to somebody building a Deathbringer without the enhancements on the enemy team. That is not the case for the Rod of Tahuti upgrades. Again, incredibly late game, 3,600 gold. What? And the first one of these two is just a massive what within itself. Why does this suddenly cast a meteor that deals a very random amount of damage in a small radius? Why? What? Why? How? Moving on. Perfected Rod is almost equally questionable. Suddenly you get movement speed and you get cooldown reduction on an item that has nothing to do with either of those things. We have cooldown reduction items for mages, we have plenty of them, and there are most certainly some of them that could also be looked at again in general for different effects. So why slap this all on Rod of Tahuti? I mean, Staff of Murden literally just got a rework for its passive in the same patch. Could have very easily put the effect on that item instead. And again, overall for Mage it's the same issue. It heavily encourages building Bancroft's Talon or Rod of Tahuti, which are already good Mage items most of the time, so why elevate these over every other Mage item? So as you can tell, I have a lot of problems with glyphs, and you can decide for yourself if it's justified or not. The question at this point is if I have any suggestions to improve the situation. The most simple solution would be moving a lot of the passives to other items, having more tier 3 items that are generally cheaper and more accessible, and just taking out the glyphs entirely. I know a lot of people would not like that. Another option would be to actually make tier 4 an actual tier instead of this crutch. So you only have one tier 4 upgrade per item, because that's how the item path generally work towards the end. But then you can have an additional unique effect on that item, which also actually matches the item. This option comes with its own set of problems. The most realistic outcome is option number 3, everything stays as it is because most people actually like glyphs and I'm just an old man yelling at a cloud. If you however enjoy my old man's rambling, then again please consider subscribing and clicking the bell. More rambling coming very soon. With that, thank you very much for watching and I hope to see you for the next one soon. DukeSloth out.